So I would like first to thank you for coming, and I would also like to thank Simon for accepting our invitation, and my colleagues for accepting also to engage with you. When I bought this book, I was so impressed that I decided to contact Simon and ask him to come for a discussion. And I think that it is really possible to have a conversation around this book, a conversation in the sense of Gadamer, which is people engaging each other from different horizons. Simon is supposedly a literary scholar, but this book goes beyond literary scholarship. And I would like to say why by introducing him first. Okay, Simon Gikandi is a Robert Sharma Professor of English at Princeton University and the editor of PMLA. He was born in Kenya, and this is very important to keep in mind, because I think that his scholarship reflects the free tradition he has been trained in. He graduated in literature from the University of Nairobi. He was a British Council scholar at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, from which he graduated with a Master in English Studies, and he got his PhD in English from Northern University. Each tradition, the Kenyan, African, the British, and the American, is actually explored and confronted with the two others in Simon's scholarship. For Africa, I would like to mention his book and article on Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, The book on Wachongo got a Choice Outstanding Academic Publication for 2004. He's also the co-author of the Columbia Guide to East African Literature in English since 1945. He is the co-editor of the Cambridge History of African and Caribbean Literature and the editor of the Routledge Encyclopedia of African Literature. Writing in a Limbo, Modernism and Caribbean Literature, Maps of Englishness, Writing Identity in the Culture of Colonialism, and his latest book, Slavery and the Culture of Taste, could be located at the intersection of those overlapping territory of empire, British and the various Atlantics. His major field of research and teaching are the Anglophone literatures and culture of Africa, India, the Caribbean, and post-colonial Britain, the Black Atlantic and the African diaspora. He's also interested in the encounter between European and African languages in the modern period, literature and human rights, and writing and cultural politics. Simon is currently working on a book called this thing called English, The Colonized and Their Books, and Modernism and Early Post-Colonial Style. And he is editing the volume 11 of the Oxford History of the Novel in English, the Novel in Africa and the Atlantic. We are very excited to hear from Simon and from the three commentators we selected, Saidiya, Hartman, Carroll, Smith-Rosenberg, and Madeleine, Dobie. We have selected the three colleagues because of their various expertise in the field of slavery, Atlantic studies, Black Atlantic studies, and the 18th century studies, and their exploration of race, racialized identity, civility, property, the ages of slavery and democracy, the challenges slavery poses to freedom, sameness and difference, aesthetic, reason, and religion. Each of them bring a unique perspective in their reading of Simon's work. So let me present first Saidiya, who will be the first to interview. She has worked extensively on the issue of slavery and enslavement from the US, African, and British perspective. Saidiya's exploration of how slavery and the afterlife of slavery have established a measure of man and a ranking of life compare quite nicely with Simon's examination of slavery and the culture of taste as the two faces modernity. They are both interested in the archives and memories of slavery, high culture, history, and the genealogical continuities and reconstruction, and the disciplinary constraint and limitation in the study of slavery. On the issue of memory, Simon quotes in his book the following line from the wonderful book published by Saidiya, Lose Your Mother. What is it we choose to remember about the past? Is it we will forget? We will forget. Madeleine Dobie has worked on the ambiguous location of the French Caribbean islands that have played a transformative role on French economic and material culture while remaining culturally invisible. It is precisely the displacement and metaphorical presence and representation of slavery in the French culture repertoire in the 18th century she examined in her book, Trading Places, Colonialism and Culture in Old Regime France. I am very much interested by how the French Empire perspective compare with, which Madeleine identifies with the mechanism of avoidance and absence of representation of slavery compared with the visible connection between matters of art and taste and the political economy of slavery Simon is documented in his book. These are what he called the two faces of modernity. Last but not least, my colleague and friend Carroll Smith-Rosenberg. She brings her expertise in early American history as well as her substantial contribution to the field of Atlantic studies to her reading of this book. Carroll was my friend at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, like Simon. And I remember Carroll was very instrumental in creating the very successful program on the studies of the Atlantic. And Carroll has been actually behind a book I edited with another colleagues, which was the first big conference we organized at the University of Michigan. I'm sure that Carroll will engage Simon on the issue of, and I quote here Simon, the analogy polarity and the production and effacement of difference, and the issue of slavery as a threshold of modernity. Her latest book, this Violent Empire, the birth of an American identity, explored the need, as she called it, to exclude and the inability to exclude, and the complex interaction of us and them that have characterized the unsettled trajectory of the emergence of the American national identity and its uncertainties, contradiction, and insecurity, and repeated production of the other. It will be very interesting for us to hear how the three scholars interpret Simon's book within the context of their own field and work. What we'll do is to first begin this evening by hearing from each of our commentators, which will be followed by Simon's reaction to that comment. So first, Saidiya will begin, followed by Carroll and Madeleine.
Guys, how many of you have read Simon's book yet? Yeah, okay, great. Then my comments will be very relevant. Okay. Slavery and the Culture of Taste is a sprawling, dazzling, and encyclopedic book that accomplishes nothing short of transforming our understanding of modernity by detailing the ways in which Atlantic slavery was formative to the culture of taste and the ideology of the aesthetic. While Gikandi's discussion of race and modernity is conversant with a host of recent works about the ghosts of slavery, race and modernity, the long 18th century, and the problem of freedom in the age of revolution, Slavery and the Culture of Taste approaches these issues with a particular focus on beauty, sensibility, and politeness, which he argues developed in part as an attempt to stabilize the potentially excessive and disruptive aspects of commerce and to mask the aggressive and violent character of the Atlantic slave trade and the excesses of colonial slavery. The text details the intimacy of culture and commerce in the 18th century, and in so doing disenchants the notion of the aesthetic and leads us to consider the aesthetic practices engendered by commodity production and fashioned by the commodity who speaks. A central aspect of Gikandi's analysis of slavery and the aesthetic engages with the meaning of, quote, the realm of sensuousness as a site in which the black body was imprisoned, but which also produced a conduit for its liberation. Like Gilroy's Slave Sublime or Moten's attention to the terrible beauty engendered by Aunt Hester's scream, the aesthetic wrought by racial subjection enacts and redresses the sensory negation and dispossession of the enslaved. And I guess I want to say what's so important about Simon's work is the way it both attends to an aesthetic that was engendered by the repression of the violence of slavery and one that was absolutely cultivated by it. The counter-aesthetic of the enslaved deformed and exceeded the norms and sensibilities of European culture in the plantation zone. And I have a question related to that, which I'll raise later. Slavery and the culture of taste illumines the counter-discourse of the aesthetic fashioned by the enslaved in the context of spatial and performative practices which range from tending the common ground to slave song to ritual and performance practice. Gikandi proffers a new understanding of the culture of taste by detailing the intimacy of the aesthetic with the production of human commodities. The culture of taste in his reading is disfigured and inhabited by all that it seeks to disavow, the brutality of slavery, the bloody underside of Europe's riches, and the negation of black life. If the self-fashioning of the European was defined through the negation and dispossession of the black self, then what possibility for self-fashioning existed for the enslaved? This is one of the central questions of the text. How is life remade in the space of negation? As he writes, for those who were trapped in the political and moral economy of slavery, the presentation of the self through the work of art or an engagement with culture as a weapon against commodification had the capacity to salvage the human identity of Africans in their sites of repression and denial. The text raises a number of questions central to Black Atlantic studies and slavery studies. How did the violence of slavery coexist with the culture of taste? Was aesthetic pleasure possible in the scene of horror that was slavery? How did the culture of enlightenment, which valued the integrity and autonomy of the self, strip Africans of selfhood, humanity, and autonomy? How did Africans critically engage the culture of taste? How did the performance of sorrow enable the recovery of self from psychic bondage? In answering these questions, Slavery and the Culture of Taste provides a rich analysis of the performance practices and self-fashioning of the enslaved, from John Canoe to Juba to sorrow songs. In Gikandi's account, the making of modernity is inextricably linked with the making of blackness as both negation of sensibility and the very condition of its production. The usually marginalized figure of the black is placed center stage, and here it's important to note that as we see ahead, that he's literally talking about these kind of marginalized figures in 18th century painting, and what does it mean to kind of centralize those figures, not only to recover a narrative of subjectivity, but to think about the aesthetics that are producing the portraits themselves. Another important aspect of the text is its consideration of the meaning of social death in the forms of life and practice that unfold within this space. Gikandi's reading is nuanced. He revisits and qualifies the literature on slave resistance, yet is scrupulous in detailing the worlds made under the impossible conditions of enslavement. As important as the book's thematic attention to the ghost of slavery is, so is its method for conjuring the ghost. Gikandi's allegorical mode of reading provides a means of avoiding instrumental and crudely deterministic readings of the relation between taste and slavery by creating intersections and constellations between distinct, incommensurable, and antagonistic registers of experience. The allegory of reading as well reckons with the specter of slavery in our present, both in terms of our scholarly blindness, the categories of the unthought which make it impossible to think of the enslaved as political actors and historical agents, or which make it impossible to think of European modernity as being dependent upon Atlantic slavery, and as well it highlights the racialized culture of modernity which we still inhabit. The allegory of reading is suffused by the melancholia that Gikandi everywhere detects in slave culture. The allegory of reading is a practice shaped by melancholia, and here I mean that melancholia is a critical method. It is a way of establishing relations between past and present. It is a way of grappling with the irreparable violence of slavery and the worlds made in the wake of this violence. It is a practice intent upon excavating forgotten histories, tracing the itinerary of a disappearance, and engaging a web of memories which scorch us with things forgotten and with screaming presences. The incommensurability between the experience of slavery and the epistemological categories of Western modernity directs Gikandi's gaze not to epistemological categories that structure thought, patterns of arguments and proofs, and certify standards of explanation, but to the constitutive outside of modernity, the black figure lurking outside the discourse of beauty, and who at the same time defines it. Nowhere is the melancholic character of the allegorical mode better illustrated than in Intersections, which is chapter 2 of the text. And Intersections narrates the lives of two representative 18th century figures, Anna Margareta Larpent and Neely, by contrasting a day in each woman's life, Monday, April 24th, 1797, which was a very good day for Anna, a day spent reading, praying, and attending to domestic matters, and a day that didn't go so well for Neely because she was making her way to the Atlantic coast as part of a slave couple. The two women, a member of the bourgeoisie and an enslaved woman, reveal the collusion between the self-fashioning of the bourgeois subject as the model of taste and refinement, and the suffering and social death of the enslaved. The fragmented narrative of Neely also reveals the difficulty, if not impossibility, of deploying an archival fragment, a description of a captive taken from Mungo Park's journal to narrate a counter-history of modernity. As Gikandi writes, if Park had not written about her, she would have been one of the many anonymous slave women who died in the long journey from the Sahel to the West African coast. This is precisely the challenge of Gikandi's project. How does one provide a description of what has been the prevailing absence of an Africanist presence in the discourse of modernity, and delineate the contours of a black counter-aesthetic, given the silence of the archive? Gikandi responds to this challenge in crafting a speculative narrative enabled by if and would have been in order to detail the manner in which Neely enters the scene of modern culture and the discourse of freedom. She enters through her desire for death. It is in the context of imagining Neely's story that we are first introduced to Gikandi's allegory of reading, which he describes as a contrapuntal reading of the distinctive yet ultimately connected lives of two subjects of modernity located at opposite spectrums, thus ensuring a dialectic between the visible subjects of modernity and its invisible actors. This allegorical mode of reading is both a way of excavating impossible stories from the archive of slavery, placing Neely on the threshold of modernity, and in staging an encounter between this terrible past and our present. The book as a material object and textual assemblage is key to elaborating the temporal dimensions of slavery and its afterlife. And there are a number of photographs and images which are placed in the text, but which are not simply illustration. Photographs taken by the author of The Slave River in Asin Manso in Ghana and The Door of No Return at Cape Castle are in dialogue with the text. The images serve not only to illustrate Neely's entry into the slave castle or the ritual stripping of the captive on her way to becoming commodity, but rather seem to suggest a past that we can re-enter. Here, memory is spatialized along the lines of Morrison's Rememory. That is, if you dare to venture to the lieu de mémoire, then Neely might be waiting for you on the threshold, and that standing at the door, the modern forms unleashed by slavery are as palpable now as they were in the 18th century. The subjunctive enables Gikandi to imagine the unimaginable and to make proximate the beautiful and the terrible, the English lady and bare life. As Neely makes her way into the culture of taste as a captive of modernity, so too do we visually encounter the stages of dispossession and commodification. This is an incredibly interesting aspect of the book for me because I think when I was reading it, I thought, okay, it's a scholarly study of 18th century culture, but there was something about the placement of the images that made me feel this is also a memorial text too. For here, the book is as much a traveler's guide and a speculative narrative that catapults us back to a past that none would volunteer to re-enter, acts as a memorial text enshrining Neely's life, specifically the loss of her life, and marks and monumentalizes the spaces and sites of those denied even the privilege of ruins. Again, on page 84, he describes her entry into the castle, and on the page that accompanies the text, we have a full-page reproduction of the Door of No Return. So I think I'm going to cut the rest of my comments and just actually raise a few questions. And one of the questions I'd actually like to raise is about thinking about the space of creolization. There's a way that in accounting for African performance practices, Gikandi makes the point that Africans had to negotiate loss and to remake their identities in the context of these settler spaces, and that what was created was this kind of refashioned culture. And I wonder how the tension between the culture of taste and enslaved culture might be transformed if we also think about the remaking of Europe in the context of that encounter too, and we think of European culture as a culture that's also creolized and not simply British any longer. Gikandi also considers slave performance as a counterculture or counter-aesthetic to the culture of taste. And here I would ask him and us to think about practices that are indifferent or recalcitrant in regard to the culture of taste, meaning cultural practices that are not focused on parody, satire, critique. Another question is, how might terror itself be formative of the aesthetic? I mean, there's a discussion of the sublime in European painting, or the aesthetic as a category that disavows the terror of enslavement. But what happens if we just simply think about the role of terror as constitutive of notions of the beautiful itself? And I was thinking about that particularly in regard to slave culture, and how might thinking along these lines actually trouble the framework of sorrow and pleasure. And I guess there are a few other questions, but one concerns the fragment in the context of the book, and I guess I think of Gikandi is being involved in a Benjaminian project. I think the allegory of reading and the attention to the fragment is definitely a part of that. And I guess I would raise a question about fragment, melancholia, and the telos of the project in terms of the concluding fragments of the book. And I guess I wonder, does redemption trump melancholia in the end? The last fragment of the book seems to suggest or hold open the possibility of a different kind of modernity, one no longer haunted by the ghost of slavery. Is this an intended redemptive telos, or a moment of excess and wild imaginings made possible in 2009, but no longer so? So I think I'll just end on that note.
Thank you very much. Carroll.
Okay, first, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for what I know is going to be a very exciting discussion. And I want to begin by thanking my dear friend Mamadou for asking me to respond to this brilliant book, and to all the staff, including Ginny Price, who have helped me put pictures on the wall and other things. And this is, of course, far from the first time many of us have joined together to discuss the Atlantic world, its interconnectedness, and its destabilizing contradictions. This might look on the surface like an East Coast Ivy League conversation with Columbia interrogating Princeton, but if I have learned anything from Simon's book, it is to always look below the surface of representations, to seek out the off-stage secrets. And in reality, this is actually a panel of University of Michigan expats. Mamadou, Simon, and I, having, as Mamadou mentioned, worked together to form the University of Michigan's Atlantic Studies Initiative, where Mamadou and I taught several courses on modernity and sexuality, and Simon generously contributed a number of guest lectures. And without her permission, I have been bold enough to include Madeleine Dobie in this. in this covert University of Michigan expat community because of her connections while teaching at the École in Paris with Jean-Edouard, another of our Michigan Atlanticists. So I am truly looking forward to our conversation this evening. Of course, we must also note that none of us are actually from Michigan. Appearances, as Simon tells us, can be deceiving. Now, Simon introduces his examination of the interdependence of Atlantic slavery and the Enlightenment culture of taste with a few lines from Derek Walcott's "The Sea is History." Where are your monuments, your battles, your martyrs? An offstage, presumably white voice asks. Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, the apparently, presumably black voice responds, in that gray vault, the sea. This epigraph brings to mind a powerful transformative scene in August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean, in which a young black man at sea within the violent Jim Crow Pittsburgh of the late 19th century finds redemption and political purpose when he descends into the city of bones that lies beneath the ocean, the repository of all who died in the Middle Passage. Terrified at first, he ends by embracing the horror and the connectedness with past suffering that he finds there, emerging a brave new man. In Walcott's poem, as in Wilson's play, the gray Atlantic appears as an ocean of bloody memories, a watery crypt from which ghosts emerge to trouble its survivors, black and white. But Simon, in Slavery and the Culture of Taste, focuses on a different aspect of the Atlantic, seeing it less as a repository of memories than as a great theatrical stage where modern subjectivities, black and white, are choreographed and performed. Two principal subjectivities take form upon Simon's stage, that of the enlightened man of taste and civilization and cultivation, and that of the African slave, refused the right to subjecthood and taste, though the cultivator of Western wealth and sensual pleasures. Intimately linked psychologically and ideologically, unable to exist in isolation from one another, they appear as the dangerous doubles of modernity, simultaneously dependent upon and destabilizing each other's authenticity and legitimacy. To understand the one, one must study the other, his economic and cultural environments, his fears and anxieties, his desires and determination. The culture of taste, Simon insists, became possible only because of the commercial and consumer revolutions that formed and informed Enlightenment Europe, and those revolutions in their turn were fueled by the trade in African bodies and then plantation slave economies that trade made possible. The culture of taste emerged out of the Atlantic, along with new understandings of freedom, rights, and beauty, all assuming their full meanings only when contrasted to the debasements and constraints of slavery. In short, blackness colored the Atlantic world, washing against, destabilizing Europe's white landscape. To see all this, one must look at the Atlantic from the vantage point of the South, from the perspective of the peoples who, violently displaced from Africa, produced the goods, the culture of taste and refinement needed to properly display Europe's superiority. It is to insist on the interdependency, the inseparability of the free and the enslaved, Enlightenment, liberalism, and racial bondage, social polish, and racialized violence. It is to recognize the centrality of Africa not only to the Caribbean, but to Europe and the British Isles, recognize the slave huts that nestled in the shadow of Augustan manor houses. It is to assume what performance theorist and theater historian Joseph Roach calls a circumatlantic vision of the emergence of modernity. For Roach, a circumatlantic perspective focuses on the traces of the Atlantic Holocaust, by which he means the diasporic and genocidal histories of Africa and the Americas, and the ways they are implanted in the ongoing performances of our cultural identities, the ways the stunningly beautiful costumes of the Mardi Gras Indians weave the richness of an indigenous culture of 17th century Louisiana and the cultural connections between Native and African Americans into 21st century performances, or the way New Orleans City Council built the Superdome, designed for the commercial and voyeuristic display of black athletic bodies, and later the containment of black bodies during the horrors of Katrina, on the very site where New Orleans' slave market had been located. And so the repressed horrors of our past insistently color the performances of our modernity. While a great deal of the unspeakable violence instrumental to the creation of modernity may have been officially forgotten, Joseph Roach insists, circumatlantic memory and performance retains its consequences, one of which is that the unspeakable cannot be rendered forever inexpressible. In Slavery and the Culture of Taste, Simon gives voice to the unspeakable, repressed connections between slavery and modernity and the culture of taste, thus echoing Roach's circumatlantic vision, a vision, I would argue, that is central to Atlantic Studies perspective. And here comes my first question for Simon. He tells us that he writes for two audiences in particular, students of the culture of taste, students of diasporic culture. Is he distancing his book from Atlantic Studies? And if so, what are his criticisms of Atlantic Studies? Certainly, Simon expands significantly upon Joe Roach's vision of the ways past horrors trouble performances of modernity. It is not enough, Simon insists, to discover traces of slavery in the production of modernity. We must go further, map the centrality of slaves and slavery to the epistemology of the Enlightenment, plumb slavery's role in the processes by which modern systems of knowing and of seeing, oneself especially, took form. How does Simon propose mapping slavery's centrality to the long 18th century's world of tasteful elegance and self-restraint, along with slavery's destabilizing implications for that culture? Through analogical and allegorical analysis, Simon tells us, and most especially by exploring, and I quote, the rhetoric of representation and its visible semiotic codes. Rather than concerning himself with the authenticity of the experiences these representations suggest, for instance, is Mungo Park right about me? Simon turns to the rhetoric of presentation to, as he says, open the way for counterpointal reading of the distinctive yet ultimately connected facets of Atlantic modernity. So armed, he finds 18th century culture riven with anxieties and uncertainties. Multiple revolutions swept through it, fracturing old ways, suggesting futures both tempting and terrifying. The commercial, fiscal, and consumer revolutions restructured Britain's economy and class structure. The cultural supremacy of aristocratic families crumbling before the power of merchants and industrialists to determine the face of both fashion and taste. Demographic revolution accompanied economic change, leading to the repopulation of America with Africans and Europeans. Political revolutions followed, eroding empires, giving birth to modern republics. And keeping pace with all this, as Simon so painstakingly and elegantly demonstrates, aesthetic and epistemological revolutions transform concepts of beauty and the production of knowledge. Change became the one constant. New men, new ways, new ideologies gestured towards the unknowable. Identity, order itself, now seemed illusionary. Stability in this world, Simon tells us, depended on the determined construction of a series of highly problematic binary oppositions that juxtaposed the culture of taste to the vulgarity of commerce, beauty to violence, civility to savagery, reason to ignorance, moderation to passion, liberty to bondage, the metropole to the colony, disdain to fear. Behind each of these binaries lurked the shadow of the slave and the reality of white dependence on what was most feared, the savagery, the ugliness of slavery. Simon brilliantly shows how these dyadic oppositions collapsed, unable to contain the power of the repressed, boundaries designed to ritually ritually separate high and low, the beautiful and the ugly, work and leisure, metropole and colony were repeatedly troubled as slaves entered drawing rooms in Britain and the Americas, hovered at the margins of fashionable portraits, or, although African-born, boldly entered the public prints, mimicking and critiquing white culture. The desire for cultural purity, Simon tells us, was continually haunted by what it excluded or repressed. The chapters that most captivated my attention were the ones that featured Simon's telling analysis of colonial culture, and especially the white Creole. What a divided and anxiety-ridden subject he was. Born in the Americas, determinedly identifying as British, a problematic figure whose status, as Simon points out, echoed Holy Baba's telling phrase, "not quite, not white." Liminal, borderline land figures, white Creoles refused the comfortable systems of difference around which Enlightenment order was organized. Creole planters, as Simon explains, were tainted not only by their distance from the metropolis, but by their connection to work. Southern planters, as William Byrd III's diary proves, were intimately involved in the dirty work of running a plantation, supervising the planting of tobacco seedlings, the manuring of fields, and the disciplining of slaves. It is here that we find the absolute intractable obstacle to the Creole's claim to admittance into the British culture of taste, his connection to slavery. Rather than obscuring, he underscored the culture of taste dependency on slavery. Simon's analysis of the portrait of Henry Darnall III demonstrates, he's a small person for such a name, demonstrates a skilled reading of the rhetoric of representation and portraiture, as it underscores the irrepressible ties binding the culture of taste to the culture of slavery. Of course, it is the slave boy that captures Simon's attention, or more to the point, the question of why the slave boy is positioned within a portrait designed to establish the Darnall family's claim to British gentility and social polish. The presence of the slave boy could only problematize these claims, especially in the portrait of a Creole gentleman. Aristocratic Brits might get away with it as a sign merely of ostentatious and frivolous expenditure, but it pointed to more in the colonies. Positioned in a slave colony, the slave boy's presence gestures to the slave huts and enslaved field hands who are deliberately excluded from the portrait, as suggesting the dangerous dependence of taste on slavery. The slave boy's presence, Simon explained, underscores the double bind the white Creole, who would be a gentleman, faced. His wealth, his superiority to poorer white settlers in the Americas depended on the productivity of an extensive slave labor force. The Creole gentleman had to display these slaves, albeit in the most tasteful way, as a well-dressed servant tending his master after a day of hunting. The dead bird he holds, I'm so blind, it took me a while to figure this painting out. The dead bird he holds, signifying that leisured, fashionable activity, the hunt. Seen thus, the slave boy harmonizes with the portrait's elegant backdrop, the elaborate balustrade, the aristocratic gardens and classical architecture that stretch to the horizon, all, of course, illusionary, since they could be found nowhere in early 18th century Maryland. But the slave, positioned at the shadowy margins of the portrait, points in two directions, to the fantasized elegance within the portrait and to the horrors, the ugliness of slavery without. These are the very ugliness, the very horrors that impede the Creole gentleman's efforts to be included within the British world of taste and genteel pleasures. It is at this junction, at this point, where the erratic black body marks the absence of plantation labor within the frame of the picture, but also calls attention to the transcendental presence as what enables the dreams of the masters, Simon argues so tellingly. It is at this interjection that violence becomes an essential counterpoint to the work of art. What a tour de force of analysis. There is one part of the picture, however, that Simon does not comment upon. The arrow the young Darnell clutches in his hands, along with the bow that rests at his feet and the quiver filled with arrows at his side. Clearly, these accoutrements are intended to confirm Darnell as the aristocratic figure just returned from the hunt. But by the 18th century, especially in representations associated with the Americas, the bow and arrow invariably signals the Native American, and in this case, even more significantly, his absence. Two figures are needed to establish the white Creole's legitimacy: the slave as the emblem of material riches, and the vanishing Native American, whose absence signs the white Creole's domination of the American continent. That the arrow is also a phallic sign, one is tempted to say a floating signifier, adds a further layer of meaning to this portrait. My glasses on, I seem to have pushed up a page here. Excuse me. I usually check and make sure that I have everything in order. But what I'd like to do while I'm looking for this, is to point to a second portrait, which I think I can do. That Simon moves seamlessly towards, and this is the portrait of the Duchess of Portsmouth. And what struck me in this portrait, and I'm not an art historian, and so I'm not very good at this, but what struck me in this was the jewel case that is suspended above what is undoubtedly her genitalia. And this is a shell which in the 17th and 18th century was a symbol of sexuality, and it is filled with pearls. It reminded me of Freud's Dora, when he talks of the jewel case of Schmuckkasse as the emblem of Dora's sexuality. And if we can work with that interpretation, I thought this was an interesting portrait because it's really identifying the Duchess of Portsmouth, whom Simon tells us, because not all of us are up on 18th century gossip, or 17th century gossip in this case, that she is the mistress of the king, of Charles II. And so it's essentially pointing the viewer's attention to her purchasability as a sexual object. And then I was struck by the black slave or servant in this picture, and Simon tells us that he's a boy, and I don't doubt that, and I don't think it's too disturbing, but I'm struck by the similarity between the two figures' clothing, the lace at the bodice of both, the lace at the sleeves, the pearls on the slave's neck, the pearls suspended over the Duchess's genitalia. And I'm thinking, is this a portrait that is saying both of these figures are, in fact, sexual objects up for sale? And therefore, as Simon shows us time and again, graphically tying together the culture of taste as represented by the king's mistress and the slave girl or boy themselves, who have obviously already been purchased. And thinking of that, and thinking of the phallic arrow, I was thinking, can we think of these two portraits as in conversation with one another, the Henry Darnell III and the Duchess of Portsmouth, and as these two portraits talking to each other across Derek Walcott's Gray Atlantic Vault, and therefore problematizing the difference between the world of the colony and the world of the metropole. So that was one of my thoughts. Now, if I can try to make sense of, here, I also had a question, a second question for Simon. And whatever happened to my other page, I think I've managed that. But my second question for Simon, he has sought to capture, from my perspective anyway, the anxieties and the contradictions central to the long 18th century construction of modernity by analyzing a series of binaries. Now, we've talked about slave and free, blah, blah, blah. But he has not placed the negative components of these binaries in conversation with one another. Take, for instance, the connection between women, who are one of the negative ends of these binaries, commerce, Creoles, slaves. Would a triangulation of the very negative figures in these dyads tell us even more about the power of both the power of negativity in subject formation, and also give us a better sense of the anxieties and contradictions Simon has so sensitively been discussing and analyzing. So I'm wondering if that one could play more with that and make us even get more of the anxieties and the instability. Now, do I have another minute, or am I used my time? Difference, I'd like to move to something which is not in Simon's book, but which something I've been working on, which I think is a parallel to the kinds of things that Simon has been working on and revealing to us in this wonderful book. And it seems to me that difference, troubled by sameness, lies at the heart of Simon's analysis, and indeed of the long centuries he studies. Simon focuses his analysis on the culture of taste, on aesthetics and epistemology. If we shift our eyes to another of the long 18th century many personas, the Age of Revolution, I'd argue we will find similar anxiety-ridden tensions troubling again the problematic structure of difference and sameness, which if we're thinking of politics, if we're thinking of freedom, if we're thinking of slavery, this is again, and the limitations and the critiques of liberalism that we have, it's around these issues of difference and sameness. The 18th century structured political and social order around rigid systems of class, gender, and race difference. But as the age of enlightenment morphed into the age of revolution, these systems were increasingly challenged. Thomas Jefferson declares all men created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. Tom Paine celebrates the rights of man. The slaves in Saint-Domingue proclaim themselves free. The French National Assembly abolishes slavery throughout the French Empire. One brief moment, which I locate between the fall of the Bastille and the rise of Napoleon, is a very short period of time. It's like spring in England. Atlantic radicals entertained a cosmopolitan vision of unalienable rights, the brotherhood of man and the evils of slavery. They even contemplated exploring liberalism's promise of equality to the world. By the opening decade of the 19th century, this vision had begun to fade. As one of its earliest celebrants, Jefferson battled to protect the institution of slavery in the United States. Class and gender distinctions were reinforced, and counter-revolution swept Europe. And of course, we all know, I think, the very telling subaltern studies critiques of liberalism, 19th century liberalism. Now, in my remaining minutes, I want to look briefly at this moment of possibility when sameness is being proclaimed against difference, and the ways the anxieties of challenging difference and insisting on sameness swamped this moment. And I will try to suggest the parallels I see, therefore, between Simon's vision or analysis of sameness and connection to repressed within the field of culture and the containment of the radical universalism seemingly promised by Enlightenment, momentarily promised by Enlightenment liberalism. And to do so, I want to look very, very briefly at the writings of an obscure American political figure, Thomas Brannigan, an Irish emigre, former slave trader, plantation overseer, who, inspired by Tom Paine, embraced a radical vision of the rights of all men and the horrors of slavery. Moving to the United States, Brannigan became an ardent member of the political coalition Thomas Jefferson had honed between the Southern plantocracy and Northern economic and political radicals. In return for not challenging slavery, Northern Jeffersonian radicals gained Southern support for their social and economic agendas. This is the conundrum Brannigan faced: how to honor his commitment to universal equality and rights and remain part of the Jeffersonian political coalition, which at the time was the most radical game in town. It's always the American dilemma to vote for the less of two evils. Obsessed with the evils of slavery, Brannigan published 4 books on the subject within 3 years, tellingly the years that Haiti won its independence. One of these books in particular caught my eye: Serious Remonstrance to the Citizens of the Northern States. Serious Remonstrances ardently argues for the abolition of slavery and with equal passion for the need to deport all African Americans from the United States. An insistence on sameness of African and European Americans dominates these pages. African Americans love liberty with the same intensity as white Americans, resent affronts to their families with the same passion, are as brave in their defense of liberty. It is their sameness that Brannigan fears, not their difference. Having long been oppressed by both Northern and Southern Americans, when given their freedom, Brannigan pointedly asks time and again, would they not strike down their oppressors, just as white Americans had done when fighting British enslavement during their own revolution? Can white Americans sleep soundly, Brannigan asks, while an enemy so like themselves prowls their cities and countryside? African Americans, once freed, must be deported from a pure white U.S. and be settled in a black republic situated at the farthest reaches of the Louisiana Purchase. Now here we find one of the first examples of a policy of separate but equal. A 2-state solution, a new black American state to parallel the white United States, located on the same continent but as distant as the vast continent permitted. A perfect solution, one might think, especially as in Brannigan's imagination, the new black American state would receive sufficient financial and technical support from the white American state to establish an idealized republic of small family farms, again paralleling Jefferson's vision of a yeoman paradise. But geographic separation is rarely enough to quiet the anxieties Brannigan's bold, if idiosyncratic, embrace of sameness aroused. Having laid out his 2-state solution, Brannigan spends the rest of his book detailing the horrors that lay at the heart of his colonization proposal, the horrors of miscegenation. Black men desired and frequently seduced white women into marrying them, most especially poor immigrant women. This violation of the purity of a white America, which Brannigan saw as a refuge for the poor and oppressed of Europe, must be prevented, he argued. Purity and impurity parallel Simon's invocation of Mary Douglas's purity and danger. Is this why we have no concept of the mulatto in U.S. rhetoric? In a land ostensibly committed to the equality, the sameness of all, is the mulatto that embodiment of racial fusions, and thus the quintessential refusal of difference, too destabilizing, too polluting a figure to claim a legitimate place within the pure American Republic. The fused individual must choose in this country an identity of difference, must be either black or white to be American.
Thank you, Carroll. Madeleine.
So thank you to the IAS and other sponsors, and especially Mamadou for organizing this event and bringing me to this book, which I've read passionately with great enthusiasm. I apologize for my croaky voice. I'm getting over laryngitis. And not only for that reason, I will try to be short, which I can afford to do because my colleagues have already said so much, so many things that I also think about the book. So first, taking up the mandate that Mamadou gave us, I'll say a few things about what I see as this project's main contributions to the interpenetrating, though often vigorously isolationist fields of 18th century studies, colonial studies, Atlantic studies. And then at the end, I'll raise a few questions for discussion, some of which have come up already. So, obviously, colonial questions can no longer be considered a marginalized subfield of 18th century studies. Nonetheless, colonial history and the cultural productions associated with it have often been approached in a very compartmentalized way. Some issues get a lot of attention, some issues very little attention. In my own field, which, French and Francophone colonial history and literature, there's been a great deal of attention devoted to the Haitian Revolution, for example, and now the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, to the point that a prominent historian of that period told me recently that he felt that the field had become saturated, which has shocked me a little bit. But I think that nonetheless, in spite of this kind of focus, we don't have a very good integrated sense of the question that Simon raises in his book. I'll come to what I see as that question. I think if we, generalizing a little bit, I think if we think about the field of literary studies, empire has been a bigger category than slavery, and this is for a number of reasons. The archive of cultural productions, canonical, sub-canonical texts, turns out not to be very rich. Certainly extremely poor in the French context, a little richer in the British context, but not as rich as one might suspect for the study of slavery. Additionally, of course, reading these texts does not give you access to the agency of the enslaved. And so to some extent, the question of slavery has been delegated by literary scholars to historians, and it's certainly time for a rapprochement of methodologies, I think. I think that when scholars of cultural productions, literature, art history, raise the question of slavery and its place in culture, the tendency has been to read in a way that I would characterize as positivistic. That is to say, we take a narrative, fictional narrative or a travel narrative, it's a representation of slavery, the enslaved, and the question that is asked is, well, how does the author position him or herself in relation to the character or to the institution of slavery? And my feeling has been that this procedure, this kind of positivistic procedure, assumes that we understand the relation in which the text stands to the institution of slavery. And I think that's quite far from being the case. And that before we get to those kinds of analysis, we need to ask much larger framing questions about the overall economy of slavery in relation to other cultural fields. So I think that the question is then, how does slavery fit into 18th century culture, and how, and I think Simon certainly asks this question, do key dimensions of what we think of as Enlightenment culture fit into Atlantic history? So this is a process that you can look at both ways, this question of locating and situating from a very broad perspective. One of the important undertakings of the book is then to raise this big picture question of how we might begin to situate slavery in our interpretations of 18th century British European society. So colonial slavery, as he shows, was economically tremendously important and in some respects socially transformative. It represented a crucial dimension of the period's dynamic culture of production and consumption. Colonial wealth was invested in the establishment of key cultural institutions. Speak about the foundation of All Souls College and the contributions of Codrington, a colonial planter. Yet, this material centrality, this investment, is not always evident in the cultural productions of the period, and particularly in the leading discourses that we associate with the Enlightenment. So the problem that Simon, I think, deftly addresses is how to think presence in relation to silence and absence, how to think slavery as a dimension of social experience and cultural experience that was marginalized without being marginal. This is a complicated question. How to integrate colonial and metropolitan histories without erasing the boundaries and the separations that kept them apart in the 18th century and that have continued to keep them apart in historical and critical discourses. And so he approaches this set of questions, or this paradox, this problematic, through the very extensive network of 18th century European discourses that deal with questions of taste, cultural refinement, and aesthetic experience. And as he explains, and my colleagues have already gone over this is fertile terrain, it's really an essential terrain, this is a key ground for this question, because 17th and 18th century philosophers tried to reconcile commerce and consumption as the material supports of sensory pleasure with modes of experience that were often presumed to be transcendent. So aesthetic sensation as a transcendent experience has to be reconciled with materiality of sensation and with commerce and consumption. This operation of reconciliation was aligned with the shifting boundaries of class identity, the breakdown of the rigid distinction between aristocratic and bourgeois sensibility. By the 18th century, the links between taste and elegance, consumption and commerce were becoming impossible to overlook. And so philosophers had to adjust their theoretical models. You can no longer assume that the aristocrat who didn't have money was the paragon of taste and aesthetic refinement. But if the proximity of taste and commerce brings the question of slavery to the fore, the seminal thinkers of the Enlightenment did not always speak directly or extensively about slavery. And so I think, and this is a very important dimension of the book, rather than focusing on how Locke, Hume, Adam Smith, Kant reconciled morality, aesthetics, and slavery, Gikandi gestures to loose intersections among different discourses, different societal levels, different geographies. And I want to confess here that initially, when I was reading, and Saidiya spoke about the question of the fragment, I was a little frustrated, and I wanted you to press home the argument. I wanted to know where you came down on Locke and slavery and property and that debate. And then I thought about it, and I realized that the fragment is a strategy, and that there is this kind of paratactics going on, this strategy of juxtaposition, this staging of encounters, would even say missed encounters in the psychoanalytic sense, where a missed encounter is also a particular kind of an encounter. So we start a reading of Locke, and then suddenly it's broken off, and we're in the planter and colonial advocate Edward Long's meditations on slavery. And I think that disruptive effect of the fragment is crucial. It's part of an allegory, a Benjaminian allegory of reading, as Saidiya eloquently explained. It's also, I think, an important, fruitful strategy in Atlantic history, where relations are not always evident. Sometimes there are degrees of separation that need to be reconstructed. So I think this is an important technique. It's very present in the iconography of the book, which is rich and wonderful, and I fully agree with what has already been said about the presentation of visual images, often pairings, parallels that are not parallel. We find illustrations, designs for Palladian architecture in British mansions juxtaposed with Elmira Castle or with mansions in Barbados or Jamaica, for example. These near parallels, these near misses, disrupt the unified meaning of the image, decontextualize it, and put it in circulation, put it into a wider Atlantic framework. There's also a kind of haunting effect. One image is haunted by the other, and Saidiya spoke about how some of the photographs are your own. It introduces a dimension of the present, your personal journey. I think it's kind of like a haunting in reverse, the present disrupting this, this vision of the Palladian mansion. So the book proposes, and I feel a great deal of affinity with this argument, that in order to reconcile the centrality of slavery to many aspects of British 18th century society with its relatively peripheral status in art and culture, we must bring into play a kind of loosely psychoanalytic apparatus of trauma, repression, disavowal. In my own work, I talk about economies of displacement, the relationship between colonial field and the Oriental, for example. I would read Vatek as an instance of that kind of displacement or transfer. From the standpoint of Atlantic cultural history, I admire very much the foray into the question of how taste and aesthetic refinement were appropriated as necessary qualities of the newly minted American identity by figures such as Thomas Jefferson and Gouverneur Morris. So in this environment where there was no geographic separation between slavery and aesthetic judgment, Simon Gikandi argues that reconciliation operated less in the mode of repression, disavowal, and more through a mechanism of what he calls duplicity. And here, Carroll has set this up wonderfully by speaking about the contrast between a kind of British portraiture in which a shadowy black figure reflects power, reflects global power, opulence, contrasting, a presumed idea of white beauty, sensuality, eroticism, and a colonial portrait in which those things are also in play, but power is inscribed much more directly. The page or the black figure in the portrait of Darnell wears a collar, not a collier de perles, as we would say in French. So subjection is figured in a different manner in those paintings. But it is duplicitous because nonetheless the image is aestheticized. This is not, slavery in its most barbaric dimensions. It's, that the slave is well dressed, seems to be, adoring the master and so forth. So a number of questions and issues that I throw out, and again, some of them have already been brought up. So one aspect that I thought was a little bit absent, perhaps, though this is a little bit my own obsession, from the discussion of aestheticism, taste, and pleasure, was the category of the commodity as a crucial intermediary between colonial and metropolitan environments. So a lot of the pleasure taken in consumer goods in 18th century Europe concerned the products of colonial agribusiness. You discuss coffee houses a great deal as spheres of sociability, but I was thinking also about the coffee that's served there and its geography. Coffee, sugar, chocolate, but also expanding further sectors such as textiles and furniture, where colonial imports played a very important role both in launching industrial mass production and in generating currents of fashion, high fashion. So it mediates between mass production and high fashion. The question of commodities connects to the question of the present, which, setting aside the photographs, which I think are really, really wonderful, I'm wondering about how you bring this into the context of contemporary, let's say, globalization for shorthand. So 18th century writers, thinkers reconciled the barbarism of slavery with self-perception of their refinement as subjects. We confront a different, but not entirely unrelated, set of questions about the ethics of offshore production. This is very much of the moment now in relation to the question of apple plants in China, for example. This question of offshore production, its ethics, consumption, and production elsewhere in circumstances that we know to be bad, and yet we know them on a certain level, an unthought to known, one might say. I think this is a question I wondered about in the book. Another thing, you emphasize Englishness a lot, and I know that this has been a major area of thought for you. The cultivation of English identity is refined, humane, rational, and so forth. And you speak about the difficulties experienced by the the heir of this Creole fortune, the bad boy William Beckford, homosexual misfit, in his attempt to launder colonial money through his aesthetic pursuits as a collector and a builder and patron of the arts. I'm just wondering how English Beckford really wanted to be, to what extent Englishness was really a value for him. I mean, he wrote Vathek in French. He spent a lot of time in Paris. It's this Oriental tale grounded in the Arabian Nights. There's something else, I think, going on there that isn't just Englishness. But I don't want to just talk about the marginalization of French, because it certainly would be a hobby horse. But I'm thinking rather about the Atlantic perspective and how bringing French into the Francophone world, into a dialogue with Britain, does give us a kind of circumatlantic geography that Joe Roach also constructs wonderfully in his work. I thought about this a little bit in my book in the context of furniture, and how we see the same furniture fashions on the west coast of France, though not in Paris, as in Britain and in the colonies. So there's a kind of continuity of commodity and style, taste, fashion there that one could speak about if we are willing to go beyond these national categories. These national categories have an important role, but they can be completely confining, though I myself are completely guilty of staying within those boundaries, so I confess to that. And lastly, my last thing concerns the way you use the concept of modernity. So at certain moments, not everywhere in the book, but occasionally, I thought that the concept was a little bit reified, and that you discuss the emergence of a theory, if not an experience, of free, autonomous subjects, personhood, in Enlightenment moral and political thought. And it seemed to me in a way that the thought was being distilled and projected back onto the entirety of the period, so that we buy into our own myth of the Enlightenment, of modernity in a way. I think that if all 18th century subjects, really thought of themselves as free, autonomous persons in Europe, then slavery would be even harder to explain, a great deal harder to explain. But that was not the case. And there were even, I know in France, at many points in the 18th century, people called for the establishment of slavery in France because it might be better for the working poor, which obviously is based on complete ignorance of the conditions of colonial slavery. But nonetheless, the 18th century was very heterogeneous in terms of experience and in terms of its literary culture. And our categories of the Enlightenment and modernity are a little bit of an abstraction from that heterogeneity. I think this lines up a little bit with what you were saying about the age of revolutions, in the sense that we have to understand the Haitian Revolution as being internally very heterogeneous and not as about the pursuit of an Enlightenment ideal in a very clear-cut sense. That's part of it, but there are other dimensions too. And that helps us to understand a little bit the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and their aftermath, I think. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Madeleine. Any questions? You have 20 minutes.
All right. First of all, I am very grateful to Mamadou for organizing this gathering, and to my interlocutors for really what one would consider to be a gift. I wish I had given you the manuscript, and I was kind of revising a book after all these comments, because it's just wonderful. And they're wonderful comments because they seem to not only engage with the book in very substantive ways, but also to recognize the anxieties and desires that were driving this production. It's a book that was very difficult to write, not so much because of its manifest subject, slavery. People think slavery is difficult to write about, but actually it was much more difficult because of the methodological issues before raised. So since I only have 20 minutes, I'm not going to kind of rehearse what I was trying to do, because you really presented a wonderful articulation of that. What I would like to do is to try and respond to some of the questions, because those are very important questions. So I'll just go through not all of the questions, but some of them, especially those which have to do with questions of methods and my own imagination of where I wanted this work to go and where perhaps it fell a bit short. Let me start with the question of the whole process of creolization, because towards the end of the book, it became quite obvious to me that in this encounter between masters and slaves, as many other people had noted before, something new had emerged. Some kind of subject, some kind of casual experience, some kind of way of being in the world, which was enabled by these moments of violence and in many cases of encounters which were difficult. So I spent a lot of time talking about the creolization of the African in the New World, but Saidiya is right to note that it would have been interesting to think about the creolization of the European. The European Creoles I deal with are these problematic figures who emerged from the colonial world, the Beckfords there, and so on. But it would have been interesting to think about what European society looks like after enslavement, because something is happening there, not only in terms of the appropriation of slave cultures, of influences, and so on, but because it seems to me, and this is where the haunting becomes important, it was impossible to imagine all these categories of subjectivity, of freedom, of even everyday life, given the destabilization brought about by enslavement. So in a sense, why I thought enslavement was crucial to understanding modernity or modernities is that on one hand, it destabilizes everything. But it's precisely because it destabilizes that we need to develop these philosophical and other categories to stabilize things. So there's a way in which stabilization, that large project of the Enlightenment, which is a project of trying to theorize and rationalize and provide us with ways of explaining the world where seepages are going to be contained, was enabled by a certain kind of awareness of the power of the slave. So that when we talk about questions, that's why I went to the aesthetic, because the aesthetic was always seen as transcendental. And the desire for a transcendental aesthetic was an attempt to give us a world in which the materiality of social life, the politics of it, so to speak, could be contained at a second level. But I'm saying the existence of this second level, the transcendental level, was enabled, or was kind of desired precisely because of an awareness of the instability of slavery. So when we talk about slavery being absent, there are no slaves in France, or in England, or in Scotland, it's precisely because of our own awareness of the influence and the power. And I would say that awareness, that haunting, is part of the creolization, or if you want to use another term, the provincialization of Europe, that what appear to be very stable European centers are always constantly defined by this other figure. And that is, I discussed briefly the influence of the slave on the law, that's on the law of property and so on. And that kind of ties to Madeleine's last point about the global, the present, the global present, because one of the questions I was asked a few years ago was, were people in Britain, when they went to the coffee houses, were they actually aware that the sugar that sweetened the coffee was produced in this brutal regimen of labor? And are they conscious of it? And it's a question I keep on thinking about, but now it's becoming clearer as we begin to have these discussions about our iPads and our iPhones. That to a certain extent, we are aware to some extent, but of course we are not aware, or rather we don't want to bring that awareness to the surface. So we all are aware of it and are talking about it, but because we don't want to give up these commodities, there is a sense in which, of course, what we've developed is a system of both recognizing the existence of these categories, but at the same time withholding. So that's part of the creolization, that fact that we have to be aware at a certain level, but at the same time we have to repress that kind of awareness so that the business of consuming commodities can continue. So that's the way I would kind of see the problem of creolization. Saidiya also asked about slave performance, and especially those modes of performance or aesthetic representation which were indifferent to the culture of taste. And the reason why this question comes up has to do with the fact that I spent a lot of time talking about the slaves' appropriation and parodying of the forms that they were seeing around them. So the question then is what exactly might be happening that's indifferent to those forms. It's an important question, not so much because of an answer, but because it raises really the difficulties of talking about slaves as compared to subjects of empire. Most of my field has been quite attractive subjects of empire. And the reason for that, quite obvious, is the existence of this powerful archive. That when you go and talk about the British in India or the British in Africa, you're confronted with this huge archive. You may have doubts about the modes of representation of those subjects, but there's a way in which you can kind of produce narratives which are premised on the presence of subjects. Whereas in the case of slavery, what strikes one is again this absence. So that even when I was tempted to think about modes of socio reproduction or cultural production that were indifferent to culture of taste, I was confronted by the problem of actually having to recover those, except as they had been represented by the planters themselves. So one question we could ask ourselves is, again, how do we go about talking about forms of resistance which to a certain extent are there, but are presented to us not only as fragments, but sometimes in fairly distorted forms. I talked a bit about Obia in Jamaica, and Mira, and all these forms of religious practices, which seem to hold up the possibility of indifference. But on the other hand, they have already been appropriated as part of the texts of the masters. Think of Monk Lewis, talking about his experiences in Jamaica. They are fascinated by the Gothic element. So the Gothic element tends then to take away from that which is indifferent, this indifferentness, by kind of appropriating and domesticating it. So again, I'm not sure what to do with that. Now, Carroll raised an important question of audiences, especially Atlantic studies. And I thought that my response to that, I have two responses. One is simple, has to do with the moment of production of the book. And it could be that I was trying to dissociate myself from Gilroy. So in that sense, I was a bit worried by the model of the Black Atlantic as developed by Gilroy, precisely because at that point you raise that there are different colonies doing different kinds of works. And depending on where you are, the sheer history and materiality of these moments does complicate things. So these are not transactions which are as simple and as clear-cut as Gilroy suggested. So the simple explanation is maybe I was trying to distance myself from that. But perhaps a much more useful response is to think about the question of not so much Atlantic studies as has been constituted, but our own understanding of what the Atlantic is, given the fact that the Atlantic is a metaphor, it's a figure of encounters between the West African coast, the Americas, and so on. But that's just one kind of traffic, casual traffic I found very useful is the casual traffic between the antebellum South and the Caribbean. When you think about Barbados planters investing in the Carolinas and the kind of developing different practices, I talk usually about cultivation and so on. Perhaps one way of thinking about the Atlantic is to think about the Atlantic as always being different, depending not only on linguistic zones, but also how we position our geography. If you position the Caribbean in relation to the antebellum South, it's a slightly different story. When you position the Caribbean in relation to the continent of South America, to Suriname, to Guyana, again, a different story emerges because you begin to go into not just British experiences, but also Dutch experiences, and so forth. So I was thinking about how that map can continuously be moved around. Carroll also raises the question of the power of negativity, which is very important to my project. And I agree with you entirely that one could have talked about all these forms of negativity that exist in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of region, and they are very important. and one could triangulate and try and break out of the binaries I was working with. So for me, the question is, why did I insist on the binaries? And why did I resist the triangulation? As the example of Margaret Rapet and Neely shows, there is a way in which, of course, the binary was part of my own way of trying to negotiate through that terrain. But also I suspected that, this is the problem, what do you do with binaries which have been put into operation so that the system can work? How do you undo those binaries without at the same time displacing the work they were doing? It's again the problem of difference and sameness, because there's a way in which the system insists on binary oppositions, which might appear not actually to be as profound as the system suggests. But those binary oppositions are important because they show us a kind of self-representation of this world. There are ways in which people want, at least the bourgeoisie needs binaries in order to negotiate this very complicated world of the commodity of materiality and of cultures of tastes. And the challenge there for us as analysts is how to recognize the binaries, but also suggest the ways in which, of course, they are problematic binaries. They're not working. And perhaps I could have gone much more into that. There were sections which eventually didn't get into the book where I was interested, especially, of course, not so much questions of gender, but questions of sexuality. So, because questions of beauty are also connected to questions of sexuality and the sexualization of certain beings. Or, to put it another way, there are ways in which questions of beauty were predicated on all sorts of diverse modes of ugliness and excess and so on. So that's something we could talk about. Going to Madeleine's questions, a number of things I thought were important. The problem of the slave as an agent, obviously, because when we talk about colonial subjects of empire, the questions of subjectivity are not as complicated. When we talk about the slave, the question of agency is perhaps the most difficult, because you have a subject who is defined as a commodity, but talks back, so appears in that sense to have agency. And one of the things I noticed that was fascinating to me in the archives is the doubts that complicated nature of the slave raised among the masters themselves, because you go to the marketplace assuming that going to buy a slave is no different from buying a horse, but the moment you start touching them, there's something different. And so the question I was asking is, what does that mean in our perception, or the master's perception of what the slave is? In the end, what happens, of course, my argument is that there's a way in which there is a philosophical, theoretical development of the slave as a commodity, precisely because the slave is not that kind of commodity. The slave is not a horse, but it's precisely because the slave is not a horse that we need to develop these very elaborate theories of showing why the slave is not a human agent, and so on. So again, it's a kind of doubleness that which fascinated me. The final point, I wanted to respond to Madeleine's point about slavery forces us to adjust the theoretical models. Slavery forces us to rethink the commodity, and you're absolutely right. I could have talked much more about commodity and commodification, and I could have talked about other commodities apart from sugar. I could have talked about textiles, furniture, and so on. But I thought that one way of, I'm trying to address your frustration when you're talking about, I'm discussing Locke, and then I swing to Long, and then I swing back to Hutchinson or someone else. The reason for that is absolutely methodological, but it's also my own sense that perhaps the best way of dealing with categories is to recognize their fragmented nature, because the fragment enables us to contain or hold on to the categories as already broken down, not as powerful as they seem to be, as a kind of I was thinking here of Walter Benjamin, I think in the philosophy of history, asking us to have a weak messianic sense. So I was thinking that perhaps one way in which these categories can be adjusted, can be deconstructed, is for them to always be seen as incomplete, as weak, because if we do what we are tempted to do, which is to pursue them to their logical basis and conclusions, then my fear was I might end up reproducing those categories within their own mythologizing and so on. So I worried, for example, if I pursue the category of sensibility or the category of property and try and sort out its contradictions to reach a kind of logical conclusion, then what I might end up doing is help the category cleanse itself of the materiality that I wanted it to continuously remember as the source of its haunting. So in other words, where Long becomes very important is precisely because most people writing about Edward Long argue that Edward Long's thinking about race belongs to the outpost of empire. It's so far out, somewhere in the moon. Newt English out there. But I counter that argument very powerfully by suggesting that actually what Long is saying about the slave and identity and sensibility and subjectivity is quite important in authorizing the work of the philosophers, of Hume, of Kant, of all those people who never left their hometowns but still theorize about the universal character of the slave. There's a way in which the evidence, the support, to a certain extent, the very banister around which this thinking is built around is coming from Long, and the persistence of Long and the connection to people like Jefferson. You can see a whole set of ideas that are circulating. And the ideas that are circulating are those ideas which are actually ideas usually we should not be paying attention to because they cannot withstand closer scrutiny. But my argument is precisely because of a kind of popularity of those ideas which cannot withstand closer scrutiny. But of course, they become important in informing theorization of slaves as non-subjects or subjects of a certain kind. Let me end with 2 points. One, the question of Englishness, that has to do with my own formation, intellectual formation. Madeleine is absolutely right to suggest that Beckford, in fact, was much more interested in the French, the Italian, and the other European, and he was perhaps the English. But of course, my argument is it's precisely because of his tenuous sense of English identity that he becomes a collector of European goods, casual goods, so to speak. So in that sense, you could say that the collection of French things, the grand tours and so on, actually don't mark him as an English, they mark him as actually quintessential English. That's what you do if you are part of kind of aristocracy. You go to France and you buy stuff, you go on the grand tour and so on. So I'd say actually that I could have talked about it a little bit more, but it doesn't take away the point, of course, that when we focus on the French, as people like you and Chris Miller have done, if we focus on the Dutch, as Saidiya has done, to what was interesting about Saidiya's work was those moments of focusing on the Dutch, sometimes focusing on the Swedes, and so on. You can begin to see either how these questions are connected, but also disconnected. They are both European projects, but they're also national projects, because they become European projects at a time when the national project is also important. That's the uniqueness of the 18th century. It's the age of nationalism in a sense, but it's also the age of Europe, of a kind of universal identity, something we can talk about. Okay, final point. I wanted to end with the telos, the redemptive. The book is built around melancholia as a critical practice. The book is driven by a certain sense of loss and lack, not only my own, but of the objects of analysis. It's a book driven by a sense of the gaps in history, of silences, of absences, and my own desire to tease them out and speculate on what would have happened if we could have listened to these lost stories. And so that sense of loss does seem to change at the very end in the last fragment, which is the fragment of 2009, which talks about a kind of redemptive moment when the ghosts of slavery are exorcised. And that's just, I'm not going to talk about whether it was just a euphoria at the moment. It's also my own desire, perhaps, to counter the melancholic with a certain kind of utopian longing, and suggest that that perhaps the reason why I keep on going to this singular modernity is precisely because of my own attachment to a certain idea of freedom and its possibility. So when I talk about the Obama moment, I talk about it as a moment when one walks away from the ghosts of the past and finds a certain kind of fulfillment in this moment when slavery is no longer part of the present, but of the past. Now, is it possible for slavery to be confined to the past, or is there a way in which actually slavery is the condition of possibility of our modernity, in which case one can hope that be exercised, but it can't, because in the end, when we look at the infrastructure of modernity, what we see constantly is we can't get away from it, and that's why, of course, I use the great example of the African burial ground in Manhattan, because those examples keep on coming up every day. In Veracruz, Mexico, in Cape Town, South Africa, the edifices of modern culture are built on the graves of slaves. And so in that sense, perhaps we can't exercise it. But if we don't exercise slavery, then we talk about the moment of freedom, of common freedom. So that's where my euphoria was coming from.
Thank you very much.